When I started work on this book 5 years ago, I knew that all four men that I was going to be studying had lived in their own turbulent times. I didn't quite realize that the time would be so turbulent so that the title would seem to be about today.
Welcome to the Contrary. I'm Bonnie Urbay. This week, Leadership in Turbulent Times. That's the title of Pulitzer Prize winner and presidential historian Doris Kearns Goodwin's new book. Thank you, Doris Kearns Goodwin, for joining us. We're especially thrilled to have you because you're an historian of such great note, and you have a new book out about leadership. So please tell me about it.
Well, it's called Leadership in Turbulent Times, which may make it seem like it's about today, and in some ways it is, even though President Trump is never mentioned. Because what I've done is to take four of my guys, the ones I felt closest to, Abraham Lincoln, the two Roosevelts, and Lyndon Johnson on domestic affairs, and try to figure out what they shared in leadership traits. And they all shared themselves in turbulent times. People always ask me, are these the worst of times? And you look at Lincoln coming into office, and the country had split in two, and 600,000 people are about to die. And he said if he'd ever known what it was going to be like in those first 6 months in office, he wouldn't have thought he could have lived through it. Teddy Roosevelt confronted far more turmoil with the Industrial Revolution, although it's similar to today. When the Industrial Revolution hit, there was a lot of turmoil in the economy and the society because you had sudden gaps between the rich and the poor. You had a lot of immigrants coming in from abroad, a lot of new inventions shaking up life, the telephone, the telegraph. And people felt like the old America didn't seem the same anymore. And there was a worry about capitalism, whether it was at stake or not, because the workers and the capitalists were fighting huge violent strikes. And then, of course, FDR comes in at the height of the Depression, and people are wandering in the streets. Their bank deposits are being taken out of the banks. And he worries that the House of Cards will collapse when he comes into office. And LBJ comes in with the assassination of JFK, with the worry about whether it was a conspiracy, with civil rights stuck in the Congress, even though there was such ferment in the society at large. So all of these people got through these times, and they were able to unify the country and leave us stronger than before. So I just think it's an important moment for people to realize that history can be reassuring, because some of us feel we're never going to get out of this time, this unprecedented, uncivil, polarized time. These times were uncivil, polarized, but through leadership and citizen action, they came through.
All right. And of course, because we haven't had a woman president yet, you focus on four men. But I do want to talk with you about their wives and some of the important women in their lives, and also about women's leadership as well. But you make the point in the book that these four guys were shaped by and built up the character of statesmen by crises, by hardship.
Absolutely.
Is that the only way to become, material for great leadership?
Well, it does seem that when a person goes through adversity, it doesn't have to be as harrowing as these people's adversities did. I mean, Lincoln suffered a blow to his public reputation and his private sense of honor that so threw him that his friends worried that they had to take all knives and razors and scissors from his room. He was in such a depression. Teddy Roosevelt lost his wife and mother on the same day in the same house. FDR, of course, has polio, and LBJ had a massive heart attack that changed his life around. It doesn't have to be that big. The point is, however, if you've gone through hardship and you've learned how to cope with it, if a person has resilience, then that resilience, I think, is a critical leadership trait. And you come out wiser, stronger. Hemingway said, everyone is broken by life, but afterwards some people are stronger in the broken places, and I believe that's true.
Lincoln's, you mentioned that he was broken by a circumstance in his life. On the other hand, I read a book about him and his so-called melancholy, his depression. I always figured, if anything, it was dealing with depression that built his character.
Well, he was born, I think, with a melancholy temperament. I think there's no question. People talk about you're either born with a sanguine, optimistic temperament or a melancholy temperament, but then events can shape it one way or the other. And for a while, that melancholy temperament was being shaped by upward success. He ran for office when he was 23 years old. He didn't win, but then he won the next time. But then at a certain point, when a promise he had made to his constituents was broken, And when he broke his engagement to marry Todd, not certain, as they said in those days, that my hand was going where my heart was, which means maybe the love isn't there that should be. But he felt so bad for her because he had humiliated her. He felt like his ambitions had been thwarted, and that's when he fell into this deep depression. But he was able, even with melancholy, even when he came out of that deep depression, to function. And always he functioned through humor. He brought humor to his depression. He said humor for him was like a drop of whiskey, or he could whistle off his sadness with humor, or he could be with people. He understood the importance when he was sad and lonely to surround himself with people. So in a certain sense, he soothed himself, and he was completely functioning during the days of the Civil War. He was the one that gave spirit and hope to all the other people around him. So it's an interesting question, this whole melancholy and depression.
Now, Todd was, because of her strong and one might say strange character, she was probably the most difficult of the wives you talk about in the book for any of these men. Was she a leader, and did she help build his character?
I think there's no question she helped. We keep forgetting about her early relationship with Lincoln because later it becomes more complicated. But when he first met her, she was the daughter of a person who was the best friend of Henry Clay, and that was Lincoln's idol, Henry Clay. Her father was a politician. He was wealthy. She was educated, much more than most women her age. She loved poetry. She loved politics, and she believed in his destiny. Those early years when he would run and lose, she never lost faith that he would be able to be something. So that was really important for his leadership. There's a funny story when they first met in her sister's house, who was married to the governor of Illinois. He said to her, "Mary, I'd love to dance with you in the very worst way." And then she said after they danced, well, he surely did. So you can't imagine him as a very graceful dancer somehow, especially the height distance between
right,
the two.
Exactly. He was so tall.
But what happened is when she became First Lady, it was a difficult situation. She had brothers who were in the Confederate Army. She had she was a Westerner instead of an Easterner. She overspent her appropriations trying to make the House look good, which is something Jackie Kennedy did later to great acclaim. But most importantly, their son died, Willie. And she never got over the depression of that son dying. So then it was harder. He had to be mother and father to that other little kid, Tad.
Now, moving along to Theodore Roosevelt, as you mentioned, his first wife died on the same day as his mother in the same house. His second wife, how did she play a role in helping him become a world-class leader?
I think the most important thing she provided was a stable base for him. He had a rather manic personality at times, and he was always moving, always energetic, always firing up, always often in fights. And he had been her best friend. The two of them had been best friends when they were young. And after he recovered from his depression, he too suffered depression after the loss of his wife and mother. He went to the Badlands, and after a couple of years there, he was finally ready to come home, and he reconnected to this woman, Edith Carew, who had been so close to him that she had always hoped to marry him. She had said that, that this was the only man she'd ever loved, and then she waited for him, and they had an incredibly joyous, stable marriage, although she was with 5 kids. And when he came home to the house with her, she would insist that he talk about other things than politics. She said a woman's role in that time, she said, is to be in the newspapers only twice, when you're born and when you die. So
not even when you're married.
Not even when you're married, I know. So interestingly, though, but she was a moral force for him. She was a steady force for him. And I think he needed that stability and serenity that she provided. It's all different what you provide for somebody, but it certainly shapes their leadership.
And moving on to FDR, and of course Eleanor Roosevelt was about as important a leader. I mean, in helping found what became the United Nations and all that, and all the work she did for poor people. How did she help FDR become the great beloved president that he was?
I mean, Eleanor was really huge, I think. She was a leader in her own right. So even before they got married, she was working in a settlement house, and she took him with her to these settlement houses. He had not seen that side of life in New York. They both had lived rather privileged lives, although Eleanor had a much sadder childhood than FDR had. Her father was an alcoholic, her mother died when she was young, and somehow this woman who never felt adequate was able to find her sense of self through giving love to other people. I mean, she's an extraordinary figure.
So she was also made through hardship. And
without a question, she was made through hardship. And then she introduces him to that other side of life. And more, importantly, that politics can have a meaning, not just moving up from one ladder to another, but you can do things with it. And then when he gets polio, it's absolutely essential that he has Eleanor to extend his body. So while he's recovering from polio, she's traveling all around New York. She's bringing back stories that he needs to know. She's speaking on his behalf. And incredibly, then, he also has an affair with a young woman named Lucy Mercer. And at first it seems like it will end the marriage, but they agree to stay together. But it gives her the freedom then to go outside the marriage to find her fulfillment. So she becomes involved with women who are fighting for child labor, for fighting against maximum wages and minimum wages, trying to get working wages up. And she becomes a force, so that if you always argue, which I would, that a strong-minded leader has to have strong-minded people inside the cabinet, arguing with them, questioning their assumptions, Eleanor always questioned his assumptions. He said she was a welcome thorn in my side. It's Eleanor who decides that she's going to have weekly press conferences, where the simple rule is that only female reporters can come to her press conferences. So all over the country, stuffy publishers are hiring their first female reporter. An entire generation of female reporters get their jobs because of Eleanor. It's Eleanor who insisted on discrimination being ended in the Army. She sent so many memos to General Marshall that he had to assign a separate general whose only task was to deal with Eleanor Roosevelt. So she was his moral compass.
How much did they shape the Times, or did the Times shape them?
I mean, I think what happens when we look at our leaders that we consider our great leaders, they've often served at a time of crisis, because that gives you opportunity to mobilize the country in a way that you don't during an ordinary time. But you have to have the right temperament and the right set of skills to make use of that opportunity. The Depression was there when Herbert Hoover was in office, but he didn't have that optimistic, confident, experimental temperament of an FDR to make use of that terrible crisis that there was. Buchanan was the president before Abraham Lincoln, and he's now considered one of the worst of the presidents that we've had. He just wasn't able to deal with the country falling apart. In fact, he took sides on it. So it depends on whether you've got a fit for your... Even I would argue that JFK wouldn't have been able to get the Civil Rights Bill through the same way that LBJ did with his legislative wizardry, because Johnson knew the Congress. He knew every single person there. He knew every senator. He knew what would change their minds on things. And he was deeply committed to getting that domestic legislation through until, of course, the war cut his legacy in two.
But where do you come out ultimately in terms of leadership? Is it more important who the person is and the person kind of takes over the era? Or is it more important where the people are and how they affect that person's politics?
I think history shows that it is more important where the citizens are. When you look at the changes that have taken place in our country, even Lincoln would say, when they called him a liberator for having liberated the slaves, he said, "I'm not the liberator. The anti-slavery people did it all. They created the momentum that created the Republican Party, that created all the activism that was underneath him and allowed him to move toward the Emancipation Proclamation." Certainly the progressive movement in the streets, in the cities, in the states created the possibilities for both FDR and for Teddy Roosevelt. And without the civil rights movement, Lyndon Johnson could not have done what he did. And then you've got the women's movement, the gay rights movement, the environmental movement. Always when there's a juncture between a movement of citizens and a leader that's responsive to those changes, but the leader needs the citizens. So the central thing is the citizens.
And getting on to LBJ, living in Washington, D.C. as I do, every springtime I think of Lady Bird and thank her for all the incredible ornamental trees and bulbs and flowers that are all here because she planted them. And so, but is that, and that seems to be more often than not her legacy. Is that fair to her? Did she do more than that?
I think she did much more than that. I mean, in the early days of his career, when he was trying to get close to various people in power in Washington, whether it was Richard Russell or Sam Rayburn, they were bachelors. He knew they were lonely. So constantly Lady Bird would be having dinner at her house and they would be there forming relationships. And more than that, again, she could calm him down. I was with him at times when he'd be ranting about something, and all of a sudden she'd put her hand on his knee. "Now, Lyndon, you don't really believe that, do you?" So, and she too, I mean, she was responsible for the wealth that he accumulated. It was originally her family's money that invested in the radio stations. She was a pretty good leader in her own right, in addition, again, to being a stabilizing force. I thought the world of her. I got to know her pretty well in those years I spent at the ranch, and he couldn't have stayed stable without her.
But of course, being a presidential wife in the 60s, I mean, it was still, she was very limited in terms of what she could show publicly. Correct?
Yeah, that's what's so weird. When you think about it, Eleanor Roosevelt was so way out in front of everybody else, and you would have thought that she had created a landmark for other people to follow. But I remember she told the story later that she spoke to Bess Truman, who would be First Lady after her, and she said, well, would you like me to introduce you to the women of the press? And Bess Truman said, why would I ever want to do that? I'm not going to talk to the press. So First Ladies, unlike presidents, when they create power blocks, then the next one still uses it. The First Ladies can do what they want, which I think is a good thing. We shouldn't force them to be into one field or another field. But in recent times, they've adopted a thing that they do, whether it's literacy or don't say no. And obviously Hillary was in a much more powerful position, hearkening back to Eleanor. And that's why I think Eleanor was her hero.
Very interesting. Now, do you think that hardship and figuring your way out of a terrible situation contributes to women's leadership in the same way as it does to men's leadership?
You know, I would think perhaps even more. I mean, I think one of the things that's important when he go through hardship, like for FDR, was he allowed himself to be vulnerable about the polio, to let other people see what he was going through when he went to Warm Springs, and he helped the other people that way by that fellow sense of vulnerability. I think women are more... But
not yet. He certainly didn't let the public in.
No, he didn't let the public, but he let these people see him, and he gave joy back to their lives again. And I think what women have to do through worrying about families, through trying to balance family and husband and work, if they're doing work, makes them more able to, maybe, I hope this is true, to acknowledge mistakes and not feel like it's a sign of weakness. I mean, I think sometimes men feel that it's a sign of weakness. I think our current president has said it's a sign of weakness to acknowledge errors. It's just the opposite. I mean, successful people, they acknowledge weakness, they learn from their failures, and they become better people. And for some reason, I think because of all the juggling that women have done over the years, and because they have been vulnerable, and they do have to figure out how to grow, that they've done this more naturally. The other thing that I'd like to think that's different, but you probably know more about all this than I do, is empathy. I mean, the most important quality, I think, in a leader is the ability to feel other people's situations and to be able to understand them. And again, what more happens in a family setting? I mean, now it's different. I mean, my sons are as involved with their children as their wives are, but that wasn't true in the old days. But in order to have a family situation which runs in a good way, you have to have empathy toward different kids, different kinds of circumstances. And in the cases of my leaders, when Teddy Roosevelt finally got away from his privileged background and he went out into the slums and he was police commissioner in New York, he learned an empathy that he hadn't had before for other people's situations. When FDR got his polio, he said that somehow it taught him humility. When you take 2 years to move your big toe, you're going to feel more humble than you had otherwise done. So there's something about all this that I'd love to learn more about and really study about the differences in women and men.
Tell me about the leadership qualities that come out of them, out of empathy. Like you talk about him being able to forgive past transgressions by other politicians. Talk about that,
No, I
please.
mean, I think you're absolutely right. I think from his childhood, the father didn't think it was worthwhile for him to be reading. He thought it was a sign of laziness in a physical culture that demanded constant effort to fell the trees and plant the crops. So he would sometimes take the books away from him, and books were his lifeline. He needed to read to imagine another life than shucking corn or splitting rails the rest of his life. So he had to leave his secret life, in a way, away from the father. And then the mother died when he was young, and the father and he never repaired their relationship. But I think he was born with empathy. I think some people are. They say there were kids who would put hot coals on turtles to watch them wriggle. And he went right up to them and said, this is wrong. Or there were other times he was walking and there was a drunken man in a ditch. They all walked on, and then he went back to carry him home. And then, of course, his famous second inaugural with malice toward none and charity for all, let us bind up the nation's wounds. Both sides had slavery. Neither wanted these things to happen. Both prayed to the same God. And even the last day of his life, he was talking about being gentle to the Southerners. As long as the rights of the black Americans could be guaranteed, he wanted them to go back to their life and come back into the Union.
And it reminds me of what LBJ said about you, because right before you went to the White House as a fellow, you wrote an article urging another politician to run against him and take him out. And he said, well, let's bring her on anyway. If anyone can change her mind, I can turn her around.
Exactly. The article was calling for blacks, women, and young people to form a third party to remove Lyndon Johnson from power.
Yeah, well, he did turn you around, though.
Certainly
assume,
on
right?
his person. I mean, he didn't change my mind about the war, but I saw him in the last years of his life when his glory days were over, and it's only now that I realize what he did in those first 50 years, 50 years ago, when they finally began celebrating Medicare, aid to education, voting rights, civil rights, immigration reform, NPR, PBS. It's incredible what he did, and he was a force of nature.
And now most people see the president we have in office. I want to turn for the last few minutes that we have to Donald Trump and leadership. And he's, of course, trying to tear all those institutions apart, mainly the government ones you're talking about. But do you see him as a leader?
Well, if you define leadership by my four guys, and that's what I think is important for us to do now, to shine a light on the absence, I think it's the absence of leadership today. I mean, is there humility in him, one of the central qualities? He said at one point that he loved Pope Francis so much because Pope Francis was very, very humble, just like him. But humility means accepting your limitations. He said he had the very best temperament of anyone who's run for president because he always won. He never lost. We've just been talking about how loss makes you wiser. It makes you a better person in some ways. He has a hard time acknowledging error. He thinks that would, as I said, become a sign of weakness. He's got a team that he's created that can argue with each other, which is maybe a good thing. But when Lincoln saw them arguing with each other and then telling the press what they felt about one another, he sent them a memo saying, it would pain me very much if these arguments get outside. We have to be one together. So he's able to communicate with the technology of his time. That's one of the things a leader has to do. And certainly Trump.
He led, I would say, in terms of using Twitter.
Absolutely.
And you would say technology as a sort of a platform for announcements. But is that such a good thing? I mean, it also, in a way, cheapens the presidency to do that.
Well, it certainly was a good thing campaigning. It allowed him to reach his people without any of the filter of the cables, et cetera. But there's a difference in campaigning and governing. And when you're governing, you have to be unifying the country, not just speaking to your base. And sometimes when President Trump does tweet, it's to his base, and it's without forethought, and it comes out in the middle of the night. And you have to be able to control your emotions. And that's one of the things that all my leaders had to learn how to do. And that shows that those instantaneous comments mean that he can't control his emotions.
Now, two questions to finish off. The first is, do you think Hillary Clinton had leadership qualifications, and what were they? Would she have been a great leader as president, even if she wasn't, by most people's thoughts, the greatest campaigner in the world?
I think she would have been an excellent leader. I do think so. I think she would have been a better leader than she was as a campaigner. They are different skills in some ways, and we have to think about that when we figure out what our system is like. Is the skill, I mean, you do need warmth and you do need empathy, but I think she had that in smaller groups. It was harder to project that publicly, but she was organized. She knew how to create a team of people. She had resilience. She's certainly been through lots of losses herself. And I think she could communicate when she needed to with people. Yeah, I do think she was a good leader, would have been a good leader. And in a different setting, perhaps, when the bosses picked the leaders, if in the old days, if you had some women bosses picking the leaders, she might well have become the president. She might well have become the president anyway if all this craziness hadn't happened.
Anything you can take from history to clue us into how long it will take before we have a female president?
I really think it's going to be quick. I mean, I think the most encouraging thing right now, even if we prevent ourselves from thinking about that level of the presidency, is more and more women are running for office than ever before, breaking record numbers. They're coming from different kinds of fields, teachers, medical doctors, and that's it. You've just got to have that activism coming where more women enter the place early on so they become active in politics. And I was on Jon Stewart the night that Hillary gave her acceptance speech, and I made this prediction, thinking, of course, she was going to win. I said, so now maybe we'll just have another 45 presidents that are women. And then someday, 200 years from now, there'll be some little boy saying, Mommy, can I ever be president? We haven't reached that yet. But there's no reason to think, isn't it a weird thought? Suppose we get one woman. Why couldn't we have a whole bunch of women after that?
Exactly. All right. Well, thank you so much for your wisdom, for your incredible research, and your sharing of all this great information with the American public.
I'm glad to be with you. Thank you, Bonnie.
That's it for this edition. Please follow me on Twitter and visit our website, pbs.org/tothecontrary. And whether you agree or think To the contrary, see you next week.